There's reasons we lose muscle or have a harder time building muscle as we get older that are very simple. And those are things like, maybe you're training less, maybe it's harder to push it as hard, maybe you have some hormonal changes. These are all valid and real, but then there's pieces that are a little bit more like metabolic and inflammation pathways and things like that we can course correct a little bit. So how do we slow down some of that age-related muscle loss that naturally occurs? Better yet, how do we crank back up some muscle building when everything is kind of tilted in the favor of breaking down? It's like we cross a certain age point and then all of a sudden we're breaking down more than we're building. And we can pivot that by changing sort of the theme or the environment within our body, so to speak. We want to make it more favorable. So first thing that I'll talk about is a cortisol perspective. I think this is really, really important. As we get older, it is much more likely that we are going to have chronically high levels of cortisol. This is extremely important. Most of us look at cortisol and we think, okay, cortisol can contribute to belly fat. That's a very real thing, but that's not the main focus here. Yes, what happens is you have a glucocorticoid receptors on your actual belly fat, on your visceral fat. So when your cortisol levels are higher, you are more apt to store fat around the middle. That's a very real, very simple thing. Okay, but what people don't realize is there's a protein degradation aspect of cortisol as well. Glucocorticoids elicit muscle atrophy by degradation of proteins through various different pathways, but one of the common ones is actually autophagy, believe it or not. So we know of autophagy because people talk about it in the fasting community or like exercise. Like autophagy is cellular recycling. It's a good thing. We want it to happen. It's actually great for longevity, but it's not always the best thing for muscle. That's why as you get older, I usually caution people from fasting more than a few times per week, like just do some short periodic fasts. But this isn't a fasting video. This is about muscle building, right? So point is that cortisol will actually increase some autophagy that we may not want at a certain point in time. So I'm not telling you to avoid fasting or this and that. I want to tell you how we can control the cortisol a little bit more. And this is just one pathway. Glycine is a tremendous way to calm the body. Okay, it's a very relaxing amino. So collagen protein, but just straight glycine, like 3 grams of glycine at night can actually help lower cortisol levels quite a bit. Loading up on vitamin C in like a true, not absorbic acid form, but a more whole food form, like you can find whole food versions of the vitamins that have them. Okay, like these are gonna be really important to take like in the morning, right? Just kind of levels off the cortisol a little bit. Plus it buffers some of the oxidative stress that might come from elevated cortisol. Now I'm gonna talk about a couple other things, but the other half of what happens with cortisol being elevated is it actually suppresses muscle protein synthesis at a translational expression level. So it actually genetically turns down the process of building muscle. So cortisol does. This happens whether you're old or not, right? It's the way it is. You're stressed out. It's not high on the priority list for your body to build muscle. Plain and simple. Okay, so omega-3s become really important on a twofold pathway. For one, omega-3s reduce the subsequent inflammation that comes as a result of high cortisol. They can also blunt cortisol themselves directly, but that's not the point here. So it kind of lowers the inflammatory response that occurs from high circulating cortisol. But additionally, high omega-3, like 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams per day, this can actually induce muscle protein synthesis by activating a complex pathway called the P70S6K phosphorylation. This means that you're turning on muscle protein synthesis a little bit more indirectly to maybe counter some of the effect of cortisol. So double whammy, turns down cortisol, turns down inflammation, increases the muscle protein synthesis. So far we've got like 3 grams of glycine, maybe some vitamin C. Okay, we want to reduce our cortisol a little bit by increasing those omega-3s. You can get them from fish too. I'd prefer that. Another one that you can do is some ashwagandha at night. That can help regulate cortisol, but some people say it makes them feel a little weird. So play around with ashwagandha. But another thing is carbohydrates at night. Okay, so as we get older, I don't recommend just like having carbs consistently throughout the day unless you are someone that really is active. I think carbs allocated to the nighttime makes more sense. It actually suppresses cortisol. Insulin, although it's demonized all the time, insulin is not necessarily the enemy. Insulin will actually suppress cortisol. So if you have carbs, a little insulin spike at night, it brings your cortisol down. Your cortisol should not be elevated at night. That is a recipe for an improper circadian balance, right? So if you have carbohydrates at night, it can help bring the cortisol levels down. So you go to sleep and then you get the little spike in the morning. So maybe 50, 75 grams of carbs, maybe 100 carbs. Maybe try to allocate most of your carbs to the evening. Now, another thing we have to look at is simple bioenergetics. We are simply having less ATP turnover as we get older. Okay, so one of the simplest ways to combat this, and people really have their issues with it still to this day, which is wild, is creatine as we get older. It will not mess up your kidneys. That is the main reason why people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s are concerned with creatine. The literature is strong. It will not mess up your kidneys, and you can have these amounts of 5, 10, 15, 20 grams. It will preserve muscle. It will preserve strength. The longevity studies are looking really strong when it comes down to muscle preservation, strength preservation. Do not shy away from creatine. If you are over 35, if you are over 40, it needs to be one of the key 3 or 4 supplements you have in your cabinet. Okay, and I recommend going up in the dose. I recommend going up to 5, 10, 15 grams of creatine, because that's when you really start to notice a difference. Also, can potentially hydrate the tissues, preventing injury a little bit more. I put a link down below for 50% off of the one that I use. This is sweetened with monk fruit. There's no sugar. It comes in these little stick packs, so you can add it to a jug of water or a bottle of water. If you sip on it throughout the day, you will have less water retention. That has been what I have found. So you're microdosing it throughout the day. It's also tremendous for hydration. So that is a company called Create, and they use a patented form of creatine called Creapure, which is the gold standard for high quality creatine monohydrate. So that link is in the top line of the description underneath this video. That's the one I use. They also have gummies too, but some people shy away because there's a couple grams of sugar, but that can actually help the creatine uptake, believe it or not, especially if you're very active. So whether you go gummies or stick pack route, I usually prefer the stick pack. That link is down below. That is for 50% off your first order. So make sure you check them out. Try that creatine. It is amazing. The other piece of the equation is inflammation that's starting in some places you may not think. This looks a little complicated, but it's really important to at least illustrate high level. Look at the image that's on the screen right now. The image that's on the screen right now illustrates how the inflammation in our body impedes muscle building and actually increases muscle loss. You look at how general kind of inflammation, protein degradation, oxidative stress, all kind of lead at a cellular level to this thing that's there on that image called nuclear factor kappa B. This is the master switch for inflammation. If nuclear factor kappa B is flipped on, you're inflamed. All the cascade is turned on. The immune system is turned on. If the immune system is turned on, the last thing it wants to do is build muscle, with the exception of things like interleukin 6, which are increased right after workouts, right? Different ballgame, okay? Now, when you have chronically high inflammation, you think of it as static, that is impeding the signal. It's impeding the signal so that muscle protein synthesis signal and all the other signals that trigger muscle growth are clouded by this fuzz and this inflammation. What happens is, as you see in this image, it leads to atrophy. It leads to fibrosis within the muscle. So the muscle actually gets gummed up and doesn't work as well. And it leads to a loss of function. People are like, why does my muscle just not work as well? Because you're inflamed all the time. The muscle literally can't activate. It's become fibrotic. It's atrophying, and you just can't engage it the same way. What we forget is that so much of the inflammation that is in our body starts in our gut. And this is not just the Hippocrates thing, okay? This is a real thing. This is not just the old saying of health and disease starts in our gut. I mean, that is true, but inflammation really does, right? So as we get older, it's more likely that our gut is going to become more degraded anyway. And it all comes down to the gut mucosal layer. And there's a number of things that we can consume that break down our mucosal layer or decrease the expression of mucin, which is like the protein that creates the mucosal layer. So we want to do a couple of things. Okay, for one, we want to keep out things that say polysorbate. So if you look at any ingredient label, keep out foods that have polysorbate of any kind in them. Limit foods that have things like carrageenan in them, okay? You want to be careful of these things because they are known as emulsifiers, which do have an impact on the gut layer. No matter what people will say, the science is quite strong there. Okay, carrageenan's a little more foggy because there's different forms of carrageenan, like polygeenan, et cetera, et cetera. Let's just jump right to what you can do. The first is an obvious one, polyphenols, because these actually feed the microbes in our gut, and the microbes in our gut then support the actual mucosal layer. Okay, but things like bone broth, things like collagen, the glycine that I mentioned earlier is also very, very good for the gut overall. But the other thing that you can do, and I've talked about this before, is take very deliberate breaks between meals. Our gut recovery and our subsequent gut barrier, which protects us from the things that trigger inflammation. It looks like this. You've got lipopolysaccharides, you've got other things in your gut. They leak through the barrier. And when they leak through the barrier, the immune system attacks them, and then you have inflammation. If you control the gut barrier, chances are, if you're a relatively healthy person, you can control a lot more of the inflammation. Inflammation's under control, insulin sensitivity falls under control. Insulin sensitivity under control and less insulin resistance, more potential muscle protein synthesis. You get everything back on track. Of course, understanding that you're gonna need more protein overall because you're older and your leucine threshold has dropped. But if you're paying attention to inflammation, everything falls into place a little bit more. The last thing that I'll note is you want to pay attention to a protein score called the DIASS score. So if you do a quick Google search or something, you can look up the DIASS score, like which proteins are higher. This is the protein digestibility index. So high levels of leucine are important because as we get older, you need more protein to get the job done. Plain and simple, your leucine threshold changes. So forget the old days of being able to get by with a little bit of protein. You need to load up. You could probably 50% increase what you're doing right now realistically, safely, and not have an issue. But we also need to get protein that's digestible. So things like whey protein, milk protein, egg protein, beef protein, these are the top in the DIASS score, but you can look at those lists and you can just Google it really quick and it can help you out tremendously. So combining these things, and then, of course, from a training perspective, if you have a hard time training to failure, you can add in partial reps. There was some really interesting evidence published in the European Journal of Sports Science that found that just training in a partial range in the stretched position can increase muscle size and strength by up to 70%. So what I'm saying here is if you can't go to failure, go to as close to failure as you can and then pump out a few partial reps to induce a little more muscle protein synthesis without taxing your body. So all these different things we've talked about layered with some training tips, and I have other videos that kind of help out from the training perspective, could really help you push through those atrophy barriers that you have as you get older, start tilting the scale a little more towards building compared to breakdown. As always, keep it locked in here. See you tomorrow.